As I said, tonight is Mike Bush's 50th presentation that he has so kindly and graciously given to the EAA webinar audience. Many of you maybe were a part of his very first one back in 2011 when he first started doing webinars for EAA here on a monthly basis, 12 a year. Quite a record, Mike. We sure do thank you so much. I know a number of people already typed in the questions pane, just expressing gratitude and thanks for sharing what you do with us to try and help us all gain a little bit more knowledge and be a little bit better at owning and trying to maintain and figure out these aircraft and engines and help us be a little bit smarter, and I think the word you use is savvier, so we can be a savvier owner, make better decisions. Thanks, Mike. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Okay, Tim. Good evening, and good evening, everybody. Tonight's discussion subject is all about alterations. And basically, we're going to talk about what happens when you want to modify your certificated aircraft. Obviously, if you have an experimental aircraft, you pretty much can do what you want. But for certificated aircraft, it gets a little bit more difficult. But not as difficult as most people think. So the kind of thing that we're talking about is that you have some certificated aircraft, a Cessna 172 or a Beech Bonanza or a Sarah Cessna 22 or whatever, and you want to make a change to it. Let's say you want to add an extra DC power outlet for you to plug in your handheld GPS. Or maybe you want to put a landing gear mirror out on the wing or on the tip tank so you can verify visually whether your landing gear is up or down. Or maybe you have had a hot running number 2 cylinder and you've got a bright idea about how you might want to modify the cooling baffling in the engine compartment to bring a little bit more cooling air over that cylinder. Or maybe you're sick and tired of changing out those incandescent landing lights and you want to replace it with an LED landing light that's good for 10,000 hours and probably will last longer than your medical. Or maybe you want to put some vortex generators on the wing or a stall kit or something like that. So no big deal, right? Well, it turns out that it depends on who you ask. And I've had a lot of owners come to me in great perplexity when it comes to making alterations. For example, one owner went to his avionics shop and asked him to install an extra DC power socket so he could plug in his GPS or his handheld GPS or his cell phone charger, that sort of thing. And the avionics shop told him that in order to do that, they would have to prepare an FAA Form 337 and seek a field approval from the FSDO. And they warned him that probably will take quite a while, and the paperwork involved would probably run up a significant bill, even though the cost of the power socket itself was negligible. That owner subsequently went to his A&P mechanic and made the same request, and the A&P said no problem, installed the socket, signed it off with a simple logbook entry, and that was that. So who was right? Was the avionics shop right that this thing had to be handled with a Form 337 and a field approval? Or was the mechanic right who just stuck it in and made the logbook entry? Another owner that contacted me had his A&P install a gear mirror on his Cessna 210. Several years later, an IA at another airport was doing an annual inspection on this airplane, and he told the owner that the mirror didn't have a Form 337 and it would have to be removed before the IA could sign off the annual as airworthy. So who was right? The installing A&P who put the mirror in without a Form 337, or the inspecting IA who said that the 337 was required? I run into this sort of thing all the time. There's clearly an awful lot of confusion about these alterations, but it's really not that complicated. And so I'm going to start at the beginning and basically go through the rules with you. And I hope of the, what do we have now, 356 people in the room, we've got some A&P mechanics because it's most important for A&Ps to understand this sort of thing, so that they give their customers good advice when it comes to alterations. So let's start at the beginning. When a certificated aircraft is modified in any way from the way that it was when it first rolled off the assembly line, it has received what the FARs refer to as an alteration to the aircraft's type design. Now, the FARs recognize two different kinds of alterations: major alterations and minor alterations. And one of the key things is to understand what the difference between the two are, because the rules for dealing with major alterations and minor alterations are radically different. So let's see what the regs say. If we go to FAR 1.1, which is the definition section of the FARs, I suppose we're supposed to say 14 CFR 1.1 now. Here's what it says. It says a major alteration means an alteration not listed in the aircraft engine or propeller specifications that might appreciably affect weight, balance, structural strength, performance, power plant operations, flight characteristics, or other qualities affecting airworthiness. Let's look at that real carefully, because we really have to understand this definition. It's going to come up throughout the presentation. So major alteration is an alteration that might appreciably affect weight, balance, structural strength, performance, power plant operation, flight characteristics, or other qualities affecting airworthiness, or that is not done according to accepted practices or cannot be done by elementary operations. That number 2 part of the definition very seldom comes up, because almost everything that we do is done according to accepted practices. So it's really the number 1 part of that definition that's important. And we'll be parsing that over and over and seeing what it means in real life cases during the session tonight. A minor alteration means an alteration other than a major alteration. So anything that doesn't qualify as a major alteration under this definition is a minor alteration. So let's look at a couple of those potential alterations that we had up on the screen earlier. Let's look at installing the DC power socket. Clearly, that socket is installed using acceptable methods. It has a negligible effect on weight and balance, and it can't possibly have any effect on structural strength of the aircraft, performance, power plant operation, or flight characteristics. It's just not possible that socket could have any of those effects. So therefore, by definition, installing that socket is a minor alteration. And the avionics shop was just wrong when they told the owner that it was a major alteration that would require a Form 337 and a field approval. And the mechanic who installed it with a simple logbook entry was right. It was clearly, unequivocally, a minor alteration. Similarly, putting in that LED landing light is the same situation, exactly. It's installed using acceptable methods, it has negligible effect on weight and balance, and it has no effect on strength, performance, power plant operation, or flight characteristics. It can't be anything but a minor alteration. So you just do it, and you sign it off with a logbook entry, no big deal. Let's look at the landing gear mirror. It gets a little bit more complicated. Clearly, it's installed using acceptable methods and has negligible effect on weight and balance, but does it have an appreciable effect on performance or flight characteristics? Well, that's a bit complicated because it's hanging out in the airstream. And the mechanic is going to have to make a call as to whether that mirror is draggy enough or aerodynamically significant enough to meet the definition of a major alteration having an appreciable effect on performance or flight characteristics. So that landing gear mirror is right in the fuzzy area. The mechanic that installed it as a minor alteration with a simple logbook entry probably did so in good faith, believing that it had no appreciable effect on performance or flight characteristics. The IA who insisted that it be removed probably in good faith believed that it did have an appreciable effect on performance or flight characteristics. So this one is right in the gray area, and it's hard to fault either the mechanic who put it in or the IA who insisted that it come out. This is really right on that borderline between major and minor, and it's a really tough call. How about improving the baffling on the engine? Well, it's installed using acceptable methods and it has a negligible effect on weight and balance, but the whole intention of installing that modified baffling is to affect power plant operation in a positive way by improving cooling airflow over the cylinders. The definition of a major alteration says that it's major if it has an appreciable effect on power plant operation. So if this baffling is any good at all, it will have an appreciable effect on power plant operation, and therefore, by definition, it's a major alteration. And unfortunately, yes, it is. Unless it's STC'd or something, it is going to require a field approval to make that change. Similarly, if you want to put vortex generators on the wing, those vortex generators are intended to affect flight characteristics. They're intended to lower the stall speed of the wing. And therefore, by the definition of major alteration, they are clearly a major alteration. So just from the definition alone in FAR 1.1, it's fairly easy to classify various alterations as to whether they are minor alterations that an A&P can do simply with a logbook entry, or whether they're major alterations that require a whole bunch of FAA rigmarole, and we'll get into the rigmarole in a moment. But the most important thing when you're dealing with alterations is to properly classify them as major and minor. And although there's a lot of guidance from the FAA that we'll be getting into, most of the time, just from the basic FAR 1.1 definition, you can figure out whether it's a major or minor alteration. That landing gear mirror was an interesting case because, like I say, it's right on the borderline. Who approves alterations? Well, as I said, the rules for major and minor alterations are totally different. A minor alteration can be approved by any A&P mechanic and documented with a simple logbook entry. But a major alteration has to conform to FAA-approved specifications or data, has to be inspected and approved by an IA, not just any old A&P, and it has to be documented in a Form 337 that's sent into the FAA in Oklahoma City. So let's look at those in a little bit more detail. A major alteration must be made in accordance with approved data. Approved data is, first of all, the word data in this context means drawings, specifications, methods, techniques, and practices that define exactly how the alteration is to be made. And that data, if it's a major alteration, has to be approved. And approved means that it has to be signed off by some FAA employee or some FAA designee, like a designated engineering representative, somebody who has the authority to represent the FAA administrator and approve that data, that document, those specifications. So it has to have an FAA signature on it in order to be legal to make it a major alteration. Minor alterations don't require approved data. Major alterations do. So that's a fairly big deal. Now, there are 4 major places that you can find approved data to make major alterations. The most common is a supplementary type certificate, or an STC. So if you buy a kit to make an alteration that comes with STC paperwork, that STC paperwork has an FAA signature on it. It has been already approved, and you don't have to go seek approval. It's already been approved. You do have to have an IA inspect it. You do have to get a Form 337 filled out and send it into the FAA, but the data is approved. Similarly, another source of approved data is airworthiness directives. Sometimes an airworthiness directive comes out that basically compels us to make an alteration to our aircraft. And that airworthiness directive itself is approved data. And so when we make that alteration to the aircraft, we have FAA approved data in the form of the AD to make that alteration. If we want to make an alteration that is not STC'd and is not part of an airworthiness directive, then we will probably have to go get a field approval by the local FSDO. And we'll talk a little bit more about that process and what kinds of things can get field approved and what kinds of things don't, and how you figure that out. But if it's a major alteration and you don't have any approved data for it, then you're going to have to make up the data and go get it approved by the local FSDO. And depending on what kind of alteration you want to make, they may be willing to do that, or they may not be willing to do that. You can also hire a designated engineering representative, who is a guy that has FAA authority to approve engineering data in whatever his area of expertise is. It might be a structures DER or whatever, power plant DER, to approve data for a major alteration. And the DER is a private individual that you hire to do the job that has FAA designation to do that. So it would either have to be approved by a safety inspector at the local FSDO or by a DER that you hire. So those are where we typically get approved data for making major alterations. And a major alteration has to be documented on an FAA Form 337. Both major alterations and major repairs have to be documented on an FAA Form 337 so that the FAA knows about them. That 337 has to identify or incorporate the acceptable data. Excuse me, that's incorrect on the slide. The approved data used to make the alteration. That slide should say approved data. The 337 has to be signed by the A&P who performed the alteration, has to be signed by the IA who inspected and approved the work, and then must be submitted to the FAA in Oklahoma City, where it becomes a permanent part of the aircraft's record. Now, a minor alteration doesn't require approved data. It only requires acceptable data. Acceptable data doesn't have to have an FAA signature on it. Acceptable data can be obtained from maintenance manuals, service bulletins, FAA advisory circulars, or any other industry-accepted methods, techniques, and practices. It's very easy for data to be acceptable. It does not. You don't have to get a signature on it. The FAA doesn't even have to know about it for it to be acceptable data. Also, a minor alteration does not require an FAA Form 337. All it requires is a simple logbook entry signed off by the A&P mechanic who made the alteration. So in a nutshell, minor alterations are basically non-events as far as the FAA is concerned. They don't want to approve them. They don't want to even know about them. They just wind up documented in your logbook, and that's that. Major alterations are ones that the FAA does want to approve and does want to know about. And so they involve a fair amount of FAA-mandated rigmarole, both in getting the data approved for the alteration and in filing a 337 that goes to Oklahoma City and becomes part of the aircraft's maintenance records, or the aircraft's records that the FAA maintains. So now, who decides whether a particular alteration is major or minor? And the answer is that the installing mechanic decides. You're not supposed to go to the FAA and ask them whether this alteration requires a field approval. The mechanic who's installing it is the guy who's supposed to decide that. The responsibility for determining whether an alteration is major or minor lies with the installing mechanic, who is supposed to evaluate that alteration using the FARs and lots of other applicable FAA guidance that we'll get into, to determine whether the alteration is a major one, in other words, above his pay grade to approve. If he decides it's a major alteration, then he's going to have to get the FAA involved. If he decides it's a minor alteration, then he doesn't have to get the FAA involved. He just does it, makes a logbook entry, and it's a done deal. So how do mechanics decide whether an alteration is major or minor? Well, the FAA provides quite a lot of guidance to them to make that decision. First of all, there's the basic definition of major alteration, minor alteration we already looked at in FAR 1.1. And usually just from that definition alone, you can usually figure out whether a particular alteration is major or minor. In addition, there's an appendix to Part 43 of the FARs, Part 43 Appendix A, that contains lists of things that the FAA considers to be major alterations. So if something is on that list, it's a major alteration. If it's not on that list, it's a pretty good indication that it probably is not a major alteration. And I'll show you an example of the kind of things that are listed in Part 43 Appendix A in a moment. Also, the FAA provides quite a few advisory circulars that are relevant to making this decision as to whether an alteration is major or minor. Some that are very broad in scope and some that are very narrow and address just specific kinds of alterations. And finally, there's a series of FAA orders that are really designed to provide guidance to FSDO inspectors and DERs, but that are extremely useful to mechanics in order to know what the response would be if they went to the FSDO for a field approval. And all of this stuff now is available online, so it's easy for a mechanic to take a look at. Part 43 Appendix A, as I indicated, includes lists of things that the FAA considers to be major airframe alterations, major power plant alterations, major propeller alterations, and major appliance alterations. And let me just show you one section of Part 43 Appendix A so you can get the flavor of what's in there. This is the section of Part 43 Appendix A that defines airframe major alterations. So you can see alterations to wings, tails, surfaces, fuselage, engine mounts, and so on are considered to be major alterations to the airframe. And let me just highlight the last two items on that list because they're interesting and they wind up affecting decisions quite a bit with respect to major versus minor. Item number 11 says that airframe major alterations was one of the things that causes an airframe alteration to be a major alteration is changes to the empty weight or empty balance which result in an increase of the maximum certificated weight or center of gravity limits of the aircraft. Now this is basically a clarification of the FAR 1.1 definition, because if you remember, the FAR 1.1 definition said that a major alteration is one that has an appreciable effect on weight and balance. That's not really what it means, and Part 43 Appendix A really clarifies that. Just adding, say, a radio to the aircraft that weighs 5 pounds and makes a change to the weight and balance documentation does not make it a major alteration. To make it a major alteration, it would have to be a change that affects the maximum certificated weight or the center of gravity envelope of the aircraft. So, for example, if you put vortex generators on the aircraft and that VG installation gives you an 80-pound increase in maximum gross weight, that in itself, that increase in maximum certificated weight itself makes the alteration major. But just a change in weight and balance doesn't make it major. Only a change that results in an increase in maximum gross weight or a change in the allowable CG envelope would make it a major alteration. So that's often a matter of confusion, because a lot of mechanics will read the FAR 1.1 definition kind of literally and assume that anything that requires a change to the weight and balance paperwork of the aircraft, like adding anything heavier than 1 pound, makes it a major alteration. That's not true. That's not what the FAA's intent is, and Part 43 Appendix A makes that pretty clear. Item 12 under Airframe major alterations is interesting. It says it's a major alteration if it's a change to the basic design of the fuel, oil, cooling, heating, cabin pressurization, electrical, hydraulic, de-icing, or exhaust systems. And the key words there are basic design. When we added that DC power outlet, that was a change to the electrical system. It altered the electrical system. But it didn't alter the basic design of the electrical system. The basic design of the electrical system is that it's a system involving a battery and an alternator and a regulator that provides power to a bus that has a bunch of circuit breakers and feeds various things in the aircraft. And all we did is add one more circuit breaker and connect it to one more load. That didn't change the basic design of the electrical system. So that doesn't make it a major alteration. On the other hand, if we made it an alteration of the electrical system that removed a generator and put an alternator in, that would be a change to the basic design of the electrical system, so that by definition would be a major alteration. So it's important to understand that. Just making a change to the system doesn't make it major. Only making a change to the basic design of the system makes it major. So that's also an area where I see a lot of confusion. Now, in addition to Part 43 Appendix A, there are a bunch of advisory circulars. One that's very general in scope is AC 4313-2B, which is titled Acceptable Methods, Techniques, and Practices for Aircraft Alterations. It's pretty much the Bible for making alterations. It's 144 pages long, and it's pretty much a mechanic's Bible when it comes to making alterations to an aircraft. Then there are a bunch of advisory circulars that address specific kinds of alterations, like AC 20-138D talks about GPS and other navigation system installations. 2165A talks about installation of ADS-B, AC 20-167, installation of synthetic vision systems that address those specific kinds of alterations to aircraft. But AC 4313-2B is really the Bible. It covers a very broad scope of alterations and provides an awful lot of guidance for mechanics in this area. And in addition, there are the FAA order that I talked about, FAA Order 8300-16, which you can pull up. You can Google it and pull up on the internet. It's titled Major Repair and Data Approval, and it's intended to provide guidance to FSDO inspectors and DERs about what they're supposed to do when somebody comes to them and asks them to approve data for a major alteration. And that order makes reference to another document that's even more useful called the AFS 300 Job Aid, which is basically a big table of different kinds of alterations that might be made, and it goes through and makes it very clear whether FSDOs are authorized to grant field approvals for those kinds of alterations, or whether those alterations are beyond a FSDO's pay grade and that they require an STC or something like that. So again, if you have a major alteration that you're thinking about trying to get a field approval on, it behooves you to go pull up AFS 300 Job Aid and look for your alteration in the table, because that'll tell you in advance whether you're likely to get a field approval from the FSDO or not, because that's the guidance that they have to use. So just to kind of summarize the stuff we've gone through here, some takeaways. The vast majority of modifications to certificated aircraft can and should be treated as minor alterations, documented in a simple logbook entry. Don't get the FSDO involved, don't do 337s. An alteration should always be treated as minor, unless it clearly qualifies as major under the FAR 1.1 definition, or is something that's listed in Part 43 Appendix A, or there's some advisory circular that makes it explicitly clear that a particular kind of alteration is major. I just see so many shops and mechanics telling owners no, they can't make a particular alteration without a field approval, when in fact the alteration involved really doesn't qualify as a major alteration. It's kind of like nobody wants to take responsibility for these things, so they always want to kick it to the FAA, and of course the FAA tends these days to be kind of spring-loaded to the no position. So it's kind of discouraging for aircraft owners. And, I've gone through quite a few of these things, and had a lot of discussions with my principal maintenance inspector at the FSDO. And they really don't want you to come and bug them about alterations unless they really are clearly major alterations. It's not their job to make that call. It's really the mechanic's job to make that call and to not bug them unless something really does qualify as a major alteration. Major alterations, of course, are no big deal if you already have approved data, typically in the form of an STC or sometimes in the form of an Airworthiness Directive. The tricky part is if you want to make an alteration that is classified as a major one, and for which no approved data exists. That's the time that you will have to go to the FSDO or a DER and get your data, write up your data and get it approved. And if you're thinking about doing that, go take a look at Order 8316 and the AFS 300 Job Aid, so that you know ahead of time how the FSDO inspector or the DER is gonna respond to your request, because it doesn't make sense to do a lot of work writing up data for a major alteration if it's just going to wind up being turned down by the FSDO. So all the guidance that the FSDO guys have for what they're allowed to make field approvals on and what they're not is all available on the internet nowadays. And so if you're if you're thinking of making an alteration, first of all, try really hard to get it classified as a minor one, so you don't have to get the FAA involved. But if it's a major one and there's no already approved data for it, go look at 8316 and the AFS 300 job aid, and figure out ahead of time whether it's the kind of thing that the FAA is likely to grant a field approval on. So Tim, that's basically all I have. Why don't we just open up for questions now?
All right, great. Thanks, Mike. We got a bunch of questions in here so far. Let's start off with Paul's here. He's got quite an extensive one here. He says, we have a 337 form that was approved by the FAA in Oklahoma City to install a Trio ProPilot in a Cessna 182H. This installation was performed at Cessna by a Cessna engineer. He was kind enough to share all the installation docs with me, and I am going to install a Trio Pro in my 182P. I got a certified copy of the Forms 337 from the FAA for this installation. I will attach a copy of this certified form to my paperwork and submit it to the FAA in Oklahoma City. So Paul's wondering, is that 337 he got considered approved data?
Unfortunately, the answer is no. If I understand the question correctly, a field approval is an approval that is limited to one aircraft. And if you have the paperwork for a field approval for aircraft A, you can't simply treat it as approved data for aircraft B. You can use it to try to convince the FSDO that since this was already approved by the FAA for one aircraft, they shouldn't have any problem granting a field approval for another aircraft. But you can't just use it and submit it to Oak City. You have to go to your FSDO and you have to ask for field approval. And the fact that it was already field approved and that you can show the documentation gives you a pretty strong argument with the FSDO inspector for him to grant a field approval. But it's not automatic, and you can't just go ahead and do it. You actually have to go to the FSDO and get a field approval for your own individual aircraft. The only way around that to get one of these things that applies to multiple aircraft is to apply for an STC, and that's a much more complicated process than applying for field approval. But the bottom line is that he's going to have to go to his FSDO and get them to grant him a field approval, and use the previous field approval for the other aircraft as kind of the basis for granting that field approval. But it's not automatic, and he's going to have to ask for it and hope that the FSDO inspector that he deals with got up on the right side of the bed that morning.
Paul's got a question here about his old 40-year-old Piper with bad upholstery and interior plastic. He says it's in bad shape, and he's wondering how far can he take it without paperwork is what his question is.
Basically, reupholstering and changing, internal furniture and fixtures that are non-structural in nature, like the plastic overlays and stuff, those are always minor alterations. In fact, not only are they minor alterations, but they're considered to be preventive maintenance that a pilot-rated aircraft owner can perform without even an A&P's involvement. The only hitch is that the materials that you use have to either be certified materials, or if you get upholstery materials that are not certified, you have to take a sample of that material, send it off to a lab, and have them do a burn test to document that the material that you used was in compliance with the certification regulations under which your aircraft was certified. The easiest way is to just use approved materials, but again, if you want to use something from, you know, a car upholstery shop, you can do that, but you just have to send a sample into a lab and have them give you some paperwork that shows that it met FAA specifications. But it's a minor alteration. It doesn't require a field approval. It doesn't require 337, and it typically, unless you're getting into the structure of the seats or something like that, it typically does not even require an A&P to be involved. It's something that an aircraft owner can do under his preventive maintenance authority.
Oh, great. This kind of segues right into James' question here. Who can perform a minor alteration? Can the owner, pilot, or does it have to be a mechanic?
Well, it depends on the nature of the alteration, and I think the previous question is a perfect example. If the alteration is one that basically is on the list of preventive maintenance items documented in Part 43, Appendix A, the 36 items that owners are allowed to do on their own recognizance, then the owner can do it. If it's not on that list of 36 items, then it requires an A&P mechanic either to do it or at least to supervise the work. You'll need an A&P signature, basically. Typically, you can do it yourself if you have an A&P that's willing to inspect your work and sign it off. But you can't, as a non-certificated mechanic, you can't approve the work and approve the aircraft return to service after you've done the work yourself, unless it's one of the 36 items that are specifically listed in the reg.
Okay, Gary's wondering, can service bulletins ever qualify as approved data sources for a major alteration?
Typically not. Typically, service bulletins are considered acceptable data, not approved data. There has to be an FAA signature or a DER signature on the data in order for it to be considered approved. And so if some manufacturers have what's called an ODA, an organizational designation authority, I think is what it stands for, where they actually are empowered by the FAA to approve stuff on behalf of the administrator. But typically, if it's a major alteration covered by a service bulletin, I mean, that would be a very unusual situation. The manufacturer, if it really is a major alteration, would normally not issue a service bulletin unless there was approved data provided that to make that alteration, because it wouldn't really make sense for a manufacturer to put out a service bulletin that would trigger, 5,000 requests for field approvals. That's a very, I would be extremely surprised if that were the case. If he has a specific example of what he's talking about, I'd be kind of interested, but that doesn't really sound like something that would typically happen.
Bernard's got a question here. He says, Cessna lists 2 different wheels for 152s. Cleveland wheels and brakes, or alternate wheels and brakes per service kit SK182-120. Is this a logbook only entry, or is a 337 required if you put
It's
the
a
other set on?
logbook only entry. Remember, the definition of major alteration starts out, it says a major alteration is an alteration not covered in the aircraft specifications that, and then it has the two conditions. If these alternate wheels are part of the aircraft specifications, which apparently they are, then it's not a major alteration by definition, and it should be just require a logbook entry.
Good clarification. A lot of planes have a number of different props approved for it in their type design, and that's contained on what the
Type
what do they call
certificate
it?
data sheet, typically TCDS.
Type certificate data
Data
sheet.
sheet,
Yeah,
right.
So that's a really important document for an aircraft owner to get a hold of and look at and just.
And
see
those are all on online too. All you got to do is Google TCDS, and you get right to the page where you can find your TCDS for your aircraft, your engine, your propeller.
So that
I'm sorry. Propellers, I don't think have TCDS. I think it's only aircrafts and engines that have them.
So then it's just a logbook entry by a mechanic.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
If you're changing a propeller, say one propeller that's listed in the TCDS, and you're replacing with a different propeller that's listed in the TCDS, that's a minor alteration. Just requires the logbook entry.
And David's got a question here. Is the installation of an onboard oil pan engine preheater a minor alteration?
Extremely minor. Absolutely.
We use those back here in Wisconsin.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that makes it really minor is the fact that it's only used when the airplane isn't flying, so.
Okay, James is wondering, is the removal of the back seat and seat back an alteration? If it is it major or minor? Who can legally do it?
Okay, first of all, it is not an alteration. It is actually the removal and installation of seats is actually an item that's listed as a preventive maintenance item in that list of 36 things that owners are allowed to do themselves. The thing that an owner is not allowed to do himself, however, is to change the weight and balance documentation for the aircraft. So if you're an owner that wants to be able to operate with the rear seats removed sometimes and with the rear seats installed sometime, to be perfectly legal about it, what you have to do is go to your A&P mechanic and ask him to work up 2 different weight and balance paperworks for you, one with the seats installed and one of the seats removed. And once he's done that, the removal and reinstallation is something that the owner can do as preventive maintenance. Now, theoretically, when you do that, you need to make a logbook entry that said you did that, because it's preventive maintenance item, and so and like any kind of maintenance, it has to be recorded in the logbook. But it can be recorded by the owner with the owner's signature, because it is one of the removal and reinstallation of seats is one of the things that's specifically authorized for owners to do in the FARs.
Clifton has a question here. He says he has a 1957 EC Champ, and he said he would like lights. Originals are not available anymore. He says, now what? Why couldn't I install a new LED system?
What kind of lights are we talking about? Like position lights or something? You have a...
I would assume so. He didn't clarify, but he just said he would like lights, and the originals are no longer available. I was wondering why he couldn't put in a new LED system.
Well, I mean, he probably can, and actually the chances are that that if he got a LED lighting system from Wayland or something, that his champ might very well be listed on their STC for their lighting, which would essentially eliminate all problems. If that's not the case, I think you could make a very good case that installing those lights is a minor alteration and would only require logbook entry. I can't think of anything offhand that that would cause it to become a major alteration, since it has, negligible effect on performance and aerodynamics and stuff like that. It doesn't involve a major, a major redesign of the electrical system or anything. In fact, apparently there was an original equipment lighting kit for the Champ. So it sounds to me like it's quite likely that there's an STC system approved for that aircraft, but if not, I think it could be. I think it could be done as a minor alteration. Now, it's obviously up to the installing mechanic to make that determination. Just because I think it's a minor alteration doesn't necessarily mean his A&P is going to think it's a minor alteration. But if I were the mechanic being asked to install the kit, I think I would look to see if an STC was available. But if not, I would be inclined to treat it as a minor alteration.
And Blaine's wondering that about replacing incandescent landing lights with LEDs. Is that something a pilot owner can do?
Yeah, it actually is. Landing light replacement is specifically authorized as part of the 3 dozen items.
Okay. And is the substitution of a Gill battery for a Concorde battery of the same dimensions and capacity and alteration? Is that something a pilot owner can do, or must it be done by an A&P?
That gets a little bit complicated. Changing the battery from a flooded cell Gill battery to a sealed Concorde AGM battery is typically something that's done pursuant to an STC, and so it typically requires a Form 337 and an IA sign-off to make that change. Once that alteration has been made, subsequent replacement of the battery with the same kind of battery is something that an owner is allowed to do on his own recognizance. It's also on the list of 3 dozen items. But the change from a flooded cell battery to an AGM battery is considered to be a major change to the design of the electrical system, and it is normally done pursuant to an STC as a major alteration.
Okay, Michael says, on my Champ, I want to install a parking brake, a handle, Bowden cable, a balance bar. Nothing alters structure, minimal weight and balance, no aerodynamic impact. Is it a minor alteration?
Ooh. That one is one of those things that's right on the dotted line. It makes me a little bit uncomfortable because it's the sort of thing that a malfunction could affect flight controls and stuff. So I'm not sure about that one. I think that's going to require some real head scratching by whatever lucky A&P he asks to install that. That's Gary's a tricky one.
Yeah. Gary's wondering if you could just go back to the slide with the 1.1 major alteration on it and just put it up on the screen for a little while.
The definition?
Yeah.
Hang on for a minute. Let's see if I can find that. I'm sure I can do that. Talk amongst yourselves for a minute.
Go for it.
I'm trying to find it. Is it that one? Yeah, that's the slide.
Oh, great, thanks. And Tom's
Sure.
wondering, where do you find DERs?
Google.
Google or FAA probably has a database of designees.
I'm pretty sure that the FAA does have a database of designees, and DERs come in different flavors. They have specialties, so you would have to get a DER whose area of specialty is in the area that you're wanting to deal with, whether it's a structures issue, whether it's electrical, whether it's power plant, that sort of thing.
And Paul Shuck wanted us to clarify for the special light sport aircraft that any alterations, whether it be major or minor, require a letter of authorization from the airframe manufacturer.
Yes, Paul is the master of that subject. I can't help but throw in my opinion that the way the LSA rules came out, I think, is a complete disaster. I think it was a grave error to give as much power to the manufacturers as what those rules do, and so much for my soapbox here. But
yeah,
I really do not like the trend in the FAA, which I think has been forced by budget cuts and stuff, because it's starting to look like a very similar kind of thing. It may happen for UAVs as well, that the manufacturers are going to be God, and that's usually a very bad thing for owners.
Brian's wondering, is installing a non-TSO'd radio possible on a Cessna 172?
Sure.
Would it be a minor alteration?
Yes.
Cool.
The TSO really has nothing to do with whether it's major or minor or not.
So Walt's wondering, for getting back on type certificated, because I know we just talked about the special light sport, but is the aircraft manufacturer involved in approving major alterations, or are they evaluated through a third party?
Well, it depends. Most major alterations are created by third-party entities and who apply for STCs for them. And the manufacturers of the aircraft manufacturer never gets involved. Occasionally, the aircraft manufacturer gets involved in major alterations. But the majority of major alterations are covered by STCs that are held by third parties.
And Carol's wondering, if you make an alteration and submit a 337 and later reverse the alteration, restoring the airplane to original conditions, do you need to do a second 337?
And the answer is yes, you do, although it's very common that isn't done. But yeah, if you make a major alteration and then you reverse it, you're supposed to file a 337 saying that you reversed it, so that the aircraft file in Oklahoma City is actually current as of the state of the aircraft.
And Dale's wondering, does an alteration that has data approved by a DER also need FSDO approval?
I don't think so. I believe the DER is empowered to approve the data, and that's all that you're asking the FSDO to do when when you seek a field approval. You're not asking the FSDO to actually approve the physical alteration. The only thing the field approval is approval of the data with which you make the alteration, and a DER is empowered to give that approval. So I think the answer is that if you get data approved by a DER, that's all you need.
And Jeff asks, when a 337 is sent in after an STC-approved major alteration, should I ever expect to receive any acknowledgement back from the FAA?
Nope.
Is there ever any reason that would cause the FAA to reject a 337 for an STC-approved alteration? Or are submitted 337s forms simply archived blindly?
Yes, the latter. There was a big change to the system that I forget when it was, but it was, I don't know, 6-7 years ago maybe. I don't remember the exact date. And there was actually a revision to FAR 43 that reflected it, so I could actually look up and see what the date was. But historically, when you made a major alteration, you filled out the 337, you got all of the signatures that you needed to on it, the signature of the A&P who did the work, the signature of the IA who approved the installation, inspected and approved it, and then it was filed with the local FSDO. And the FSDO would typically look at it, and if there was something wrong with it, they would get back to you. And then ultimately the local FSDO would then forward it on to Oak City. The change that they made, whenever it was, 6-7 years ago, cut out the FSDOs from that process and said that from a certain date forward, 337s would not be submitted to the local FSDOs. They would be submitted directly to Oak City. So that screening process that used to happen went away. And as far as I know, when the 337s go to Oak City, which they do now by the gazillions, nobody really looks at them. They just go into the file. So there really isn't any screening anymore. And this was another one of those things that the FAA did, I think, in response to budget cuts and stuff, where they just decided that they had to cut down FSDO workload, and one way of doing that was to stop 337s from going through the FSDOs, except for cases where somebody was actually asking for field approval. But the typical 337s where the data is already approved, they just go straight to Oak City, and I don't really think anybody looks at them down there.
And request here, just wondering if you could go to your screen that had the advisory circulars listed on it.
I will try. Let's see here. I'm looking at these itty-bitty thumbnails. It's a little hard to pick them out. I think that's the one.
That's the one. Yes, thank you. Okay, so John says my A&P IA installed STC'd engine monitor.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, he failed to file a 337 and is now deceased. How can I correct this?
Very, very easily. All you need to do is go to any old A&P and ask them to file, write up and file a 337 for you. The data is already approved. You've got the STC. And in fact, it's not uncommon for mechanics to discover something that needed a 337 and didn't have one, and they can't even determine who made the alteration or when it was done. And so I've seen 337 submitted that described the alteration and said it was performed by persons unknown on a date that's unknown, and it just goes into the system and documents it. So there's no problem getting a 337 after the fact. In fact, I had a situation on my airplane where a zillion years ago, long before I was a mechanic or knew anything about any of this stuff, I had some Rosin sun visors installed in my Cessna 310, and in fact, I had them installed in my Cessna 310 at a fly-in by Jim Rosin himself, and there was never any paperwork on it. And about 10 years later, some sharp-eyed IA said, "You don't have a 337 for your Rosin sun visors." And I said, "I didn't know I needed one. Jim put them in." So we filed a 337. It's not a problem. It happens all the time.
So Edward's wondering, does replacing electrical fuses with circuit breakers rise to the level of a change of the basic design?
Again, that's a judgment call for the installing mechanic, but if it were my call, I would say that it does. I would say that changing fuses to circuit breakers would constitute a major alteration. But again, each mechanic is entitled to make that call individually. There isn't anything in black and white anywhere from the FAA that addresses that, as far as I know. And
as long as you're making,
I guess my gut feeling is that changing fuses to circuit breakers probably constitutes a major alteration. I would actually want to research what AC 4313-2B has to say about that. They might have some guidance in there on that subject, and I just don't have that document sufficiently well memorized to be able to tell you off the top of my head.
You want to take a guess at this one from Robert. He said, would an avionics master switch addition be a major alteration if none existed before? Tough ones here, yeah.
Yeah, that one's kind of on the dotted line, and on that one I'm probably leaning towards calling it a minor alteration. But that's a close call.
Walt's wondering, do alterations require the use of certificated parts or assemblies?
Well, alterations, the rules for what parts you can use are no different for alterations than they are for ordinary repairs. And that's a pretty complicated subject, but basically there are lots of cases where we can use parts on airplanes that are not specifically approved. It's a very complicated subject. I can't really deal with that. That's a whole webinar.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll put it on the list maybe. Maybe that's an upcoming one.
Okay.
I remember seeing an STC, somebody got approved for the old Continental 65 horse engines on, I think maybe this one was on a T-Craft, but I think he put a starting system and got it STC'd, and it was basically a cordless drill. It was the power behind it. So I know the cordless drill wasn't certified by the FAA in any way, other than they
were
I guess certified because they issued the STC.
Exactly.
Yeah. So in that application, it is.
I think that sounds pretty cool to me. I like that.
Do alteration, let's see, I just read you that one. Roger's asking, lightweight starters and alternators are often advertised as direct replacements of original items, offering better performance and lighter weight. Are these major or minor?
They're typically either PMA approved for direct replacement or they're covered by an STC, but typically there's no paperwork issue involved, and I think most of them are most of them don't involve an STC. I think most of them are certificated for direct replacement.
Michelle's got a really interesting question here. And what if the installing mechanic incorrectly decides whether the alteration is major or minor? What is the owner's liability or responsibility?
Well, the risk is that at some annual inspection down the road, somebody is going to say, "Hey, wait a minute," and kind of like what happened with that guy in his gear mirror. And if you get hung up during an annual inspection, you may need to either reverse the alteration, remove whatever it was that's causing the problem, or go seek a field approval for it. That's really the liability. It's not nobody's going to go back and say, "Hey, you were flying around this way for 5 years, so we're going to put you in jail," or anything like that. But typically the problem arises when during an annual inspection an IA sees something and says, "Hey, that appears to be a major alteration," without any proper documentation.
Walt's wondering, in a certificated aircraft, are avionics upgrades usually an STC, a major alteration, or something else?
Well, it depends on the nature of the avionics upgrade. Navcoms typically are of no interest whatsoever to the FAA. On the other hand, autopilots are intensely interesting to the FAA because they get involved with the flight control. So, typical, Navcom kinds of installs, GPS installs, if they're not IFR approved, are all considered minor alterations. But an autopilot installation is a major alteration, and IFR approved GPSs used to be treated as a major alteration, and now I think the situation is a little bit complicated, and there's a whole advisory circular that discusses what it takes to get an IFR approved GPS installation approved. It's a pretty complicated issue these days.
Now you got that AC on your screen there. That must be the 20-138 Delta.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we got another question that kind of relates to that about ADSB, and I see there's an advisory circular on that also. But Wally's wondering, is adding a piece of avionics like an ADSB out transponder constitute a 337? And how about the necessary antennas?
Well, to be honest, I've not gotten involved in ADSB installation on my aircraft, and I've not read that advisory circular that's on the screen, so I can't answer the question. My gut feeling is that it probably is not a major alteration. It's probably minor, but I don't know that for sure without doing some research.
And Terry's wondering, who's responsible for submitting a new completed 337 to the FAA, the installer or the owner?
It's normally submitted by the installer. As far as legal obligation, I think it's the installer's legal obligation to submit it.
Okay, Stephen has a 1979 Cessna 310R. I would like to add a filter between vacuum pump outlet and de-ice valves. Major or minor? What do you think?
I think it's minor. I'm not sure why he wants to do it though. since except when the boots are being activated, the air out of the pumps is simply vented overboard by the control valve. I'm not sure what benefit there would be of filtering it, but if you did put a filter in there, I don't see anything that would, well, I don't know. The threshold question is whether it changes the basic design of the de-icing system. Again, that's a judgment call. I don't think it rises to the level of changing the basic design myself. I would sort of question what the value of doing it is, however.
Yeah. Well, it's obvious that, you know, some of these very specific examples that some of our attendees are putting in here are kind of gray, and it's the judgment of the mechanic. So it's really important that they start working with their mechanic. And
Right.
some of the stuff is obviously, like you mentioned, going to take some research on that mechanic's part to try and figure it out. It's kind of hard for you just off the cuff to do it.
Yeah, the key thing is some of these things that are in the gray area, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. You know, sometimes it's a close call. And the important thing to understand is that the call is made by the installing mechanic. So the guy who put the DC outlet in his airplane is a perfect example. He went to an avionics shop, and they said it was a major alteration. It was going to be a big deal. And then he went to his A&P, and the A&P said it's a minor alteration, and he put it in the logbook entry. Now, I personally think that the A&P was absolutely correct in what he did. But the lesson here is, you know, if you go to a mechanic and ask for an alteration and the mechanic classifies it as major, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's major in the eyes of everybody, and it might be worth getting a second or a third opinion from other mechanics and see whether you can find a mechanic who doesn't believe that it's above his pay grade. Because that's basically what that question is. I mean, each mechanic has to make a judgment as to whether he is comfortable approving that alteration himself as a minor one, or whether he feels that it's above his pay grade and he has to kick it upstairs to the FAA, making a major. And each mechanic is entitled to make that decision independently.
Okay, so Tom is wondering, he says he's got a C-35 Bonanza that has been highly modified with numerous STCs by Beryl D. Shannon, and was wondering if I could install an IO550 in the plane, as there is a STC that is not currently being sold by the company that originally sold it, if I followed the directions of the old STC.
Well, there's a rule that was added to the FARs, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, that requires that for you to make a major alteration pursuant to an STC, you have to obtain a letter of authorization from the STC holder to do that. You can't just make a Xerox copy of the STC paperwork and use it to justify the major alteration. You have to have a letter of authorization from the STC holder, which typically means you paid the money for the privilege of using their STC. And that became part of the FARs 10 years ago or so. It didn't used to be that way. And people were kind of ripping off STCs right and left. So the FAA made a change. And now you need a letter of authorization from the STC holder, which basically means if the STC holder goes away, the STC goes away with him, because there isn't anybody left to issue the letters of authorization.
So in a case like that, his recourse would be field approval.
Yeah, but for something like that, you'd never get a field approval. That one is probably way above the FSDO inspector's pay grade to do. He would vector you off to the aircraft certification office, and you'd probably sit in line for 3 years waiting for them to get to your project.
Oh, jeez. Dennis is asking, is the install manual for equipment with an AML STC considered approved data? For example, my Cessna is listed on the AML list for a JPI engine monitor. What do I need to do now to install that monitor in my plane?
You just install it and have an IA sign the 337 and have it sent to Oak City. You've got the approved data in the form of the STC. So you don't have to deal with the FAA other than just sending it off to Oak City.
Okay, so John just wants to follow up here. I think we might have already beat this to death, but John's just wondering, what was the right answer on the landing mirrors?
Well, that was one of those gray area things. There wasn't really a right answer. It was basically a case of what would make that gear mirror a major alteration would be if it had an appreciable effect on performance or flight characteristics. And so the installing mechanic would have to make that call as to whether that mirror would have an appreciable effect on performance or flight characteristics. And, clearly any effect that it would have would be very, very small, but appreciable means enough to notice. So it's a close call.
All right, we're winding down here. Richard's got this question. He says, I would say a JPI analyzer does not fit the definition of a major alteration. Why then do they have STCs that come with them?
The reason, and that's a really good question. There are a lot of things that have STCs that really shouldn't be major alterations, and the classic example is the Rosin sun visor. Now, by no stretch of the imagination could you look at the definition in FAR 1.1 or anything in Part 43, Appendix A, and conclude that putting in a plastic sun visor constitutes a major alteration of the aircraft. It's not structural. It's not in the airflow. It doesn't affect anything. So why did Rosin apply for an STC for their sun visors? Because the FARs say that if you have an STC, that people aren't allowed to use the STC without getting a letter of authorization from you to do so, and that means you get to collect money from it. So it provides protection for the manufacturer. Now, in my opinion, the guy in the FAA who granted Rosin their STC made a mistake, because the FAA is not supposed to grant STCs for minor alterations, and putting in those sun visors is about as minor as they get. But the fact is that Rosin did convince somebody in the FAA to sign off STC paperwork, and that gives them a level of protection of their intellectual property that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So that's the reason those things happen. Whether a JPI engine monitor constitutes a major alteration really depends on whether it's installed as primary instrumentation, in which case it definitely is a major alteration, or whether it's installed as supplemental, and also what kinds of sensors it has installed, and whether those sensors, for example, a fuel flow sensor, constitute a change to the basic design of, say, the fuel system. So some JPI monitors clearly are major alterations, and some, it seems to me, are not, depending on the scope of the monitor and how it's used. But just because it's a minor alteration does not seem to deter manufacturers from seeking and obtaining STCs, and there's lots of cases where the FAA has issued an STC for something that by rights really didn't need it. And I think they shouldn't do that, but the fact is that they do.
Wow, good answer. Oh, very good. Well, Mike, great presentation, great webinar. We've reached the end of our allotted time here for our webinar tonight. Again, thank you so much for all you do for us. I know we had a lot of comments from people expressing thanks and gratitude on the milestone of your 50th presentation for the EAA webinar series. Please go ahead and make closing comments to the attendees.
I'm glad you were keeping count, because I had no idea it was the 50th. So
that's awesome.
It's good that somebody's keeping count.
Gosh.
At any rate, here are the next 3 webinars through the end of the year. In October, we're going to be doing a webinar on oleos and how oleo struts, air oil struts work. They're kind of pretty clever. November 4th, we're going to be sort of kicking off the winter flying season with a presentation about carbon monoxide, which is can be a hazard all year round, but is mostly a hazard during winter flying when people are using cabin heaters and so on. And then in December, we'll be doing a webinar on piston engine efficiency or inefficiency, and why it is that only about 1/3 of the energy that is in the avgas we buy actually makes it to the propeller and generates thrust, and why about 2/3 of it winds up being wasted. Kind of an interesting subject, and talking about some of the things that we can do to improve the dismal efficiency of our piston engines. Just a reminder to those of you who have not already done so that to sign up for my free monthly newsletter that's devoted to various maintenance-related subjects. You can do that in 2 ways, either by going to savvyaviator.com and signing up for the newsletter, or during the survey at the end of this webinar that Tim is going to be putting up. There'll be a checkbox that you can check if you want to be on the newsletter list, and then Tim sends me your information and we put you on the list. And finally, if you haven't seen it yet, I would encourage you to get a copy of my book Manifesto, which is now about a year old, and it's available on Amazon for some ridiculously small amount of money, and I think you'll enjoy it. So that's about all I have, Tim, and we'll see everybody next month.
Thanks, Mike. Great webinar. Have a great evening, everybody. Thank you so much. See you next week.
Night, everybody.